Hello and welcome to the first update of 2024. We start out with a general situational analysis and update on what's going on right now, and then we'll go over a quick overview of what happened in 2023. So if we start out in the north, we see that in the Kharkiv region, the Russian forces are fighting here against the Ukrainians in the direction of the village of Sinkivka. Sinkivka is acting as a outpost for the Ukrainian. They are trying to hold on to it for as long as possible to create this buffer zone between Kupiansk, Petropavlivka, and the Russians in the north. The Russians have, despite months of fighting and multiple times getting a foothold within the village, been unable to capture the village and right now do not have a foothold within it, and as such fighting continues outside of the village as the Russians bombard the village and the Ukrainians respond with fire in the forest areas that the Russians occupy, and the Ukrainians are trying to recapture some of these positions in the forest lines. So there's a lot of back and forth in the forest lines here in the north of Kupiansk. Moving on to the Kreminna direction, we see here that the fighting is focused around the west of Kreminna, both to the south and going through the Serebryanki forest area, all the way to Torske, Sarishne, Yampolivka, and Terny. The fighting here is focused around the Russians reaching the Serebets river line, which the Ukrainians hold control of both banks, both the left and the right bank of the river, and as such we see that the Russians are trying here to gain control over the fields to the east of the riverbank and to gain control of the villages to solidify their control by the riverbank. And finally, there's also a lot of fighting here in the Serebryanki forest area. The fighting here is very positional and is based on the developments other places, as the balance of power here is very even, and whenever the Russians attack, it is because they see an opening in the Ukrainian defenders, either because they are rotating or other reasons, and from that they try to advance. After each advances, they advance a bit and then the front returns to a grinding halt. The reason for that is the opening that the Russians found had been taken advantage of. It is over, and then they return to this positional fighting where there are tanks hitting each other, there's artillery hitting each other's positions, and infantry storming each other's trenches, which is very tough and very heavy attritional warfare, but that is the nature of the fighting here in this direction. We then move on to the north of Bakhmut, where the Russians have started operations in this direction as a response to the end of the Ukrainian offensive in this direction. So we're seeing that the Russians in the Bakhmut area are fighting in three directions. To the north of Vesele and Yakovlivka, in the northeastern parts of the Bakhmut direction, fighting in the direction of Siversk and trying to expand their zone of control to the south of the village and encroach on the Ukrainian positions here to the south of the Severodonetsk river that goes through the north of Siversk to Sloviansk, and from the south in the direction of Bakhmut to try and close off this salient that the Ukrainians hold in the Siversk direction, as it would be difficult for the Ukrainians to resupply and gain or move through the Severodonetsk river in the north of Siversk, and with the supply roads being cut off in the south, the Russians have the potential to pressure the Ukrainian positions here in the Siversk direction and try to close this gap. But it also requires Russians to move through the southwest of Kreminna through the Serebryanki forest area in the direction of Liman. As for the northern and southern flanks of Bakhmut, after the Ukrainian offensive, the Russians started their own in the northern flank of Bakhmut, where they managed to gain a foothold in Bohdyanivka, and the village is now split in half. They managed to recapture Khomove and all of the territory the Ukrainians captured in their own offensive in the northern flanks. The fighting is now taking place by the road in between Bakhmut and Chasiv Yar, where the Russians are now within 2 kilometers of the town, and the Russians are also pressing in Bohdyanivka in the direction of Ryorivka to match the front line with the canal that goes through the west of Bakhmut. The operations here is to ensure the security of Bakhmut and move westwards in the direction of the Konstantinivka-Sloviansk line, which is the biggest and final defensive line of the Ukrainians in the Donetsk region. As for the southern flank of Bakhmut, there's hardly been any advancements by the Russians here after the Ukrainian offensive. They did manage to capture the fortifications to the north of Klishchiivka, and they managed to gain a foothold within Andrivka, which pretty much doesn't exist anymore. They secured the northern flank of Kuryomivka by the forest lines, and as such we can now expect a offensive operation by the Russians from 3 different directions. But it seems that this section of the front line is not yet their priority, as they are focusing more on the northern flank of Bakhmut and in the direction of Avdiivka and into the southwest of Donetsk. We start out in the direction of Avdiivka, where fighting continues in the northern flank by Stepove, by the coke plant area and the dacha area here to the northeast of Avdiivka. We also see fighting in the southeast within the residential area of Avdiivka, the city proper. And finally, in the southern flank of Avdiivka, where the Russians are fighting in the direction of Severne and Tunenke. So the fighting here is taking place in 4 different directions, where the Russians are here trying to gain any sort of advantage, which allows them to get closer to either cutting off Avdiivka from the rest of Ukraine, or simply storming it in the southern parts to try and gain control of it. We're seeing constant attempts by the Russians to attack the Ukrainian forces, both where they are strongest and also where they are weakest. The strongest defenders of the Ukrainians in the Avdiivka area are the flanks, as they know after the Russian attempts and capture of Bakhmut that the key to the Russians capturing Bakhmut was the flanks of Bakhmut. Since then, they had fortified their flanks, they have fortified the railways, they have fortified Stepove, Berdeshi, and they've reinforced their areas, built tunnels and trenches, all of this to prepare for that. We also see that the strongest fortifications Avdiivka has is in the north and the south of the city. However, this is also because those are the weakest area of Avdiivka. Since the city itself sort of acts as a wall between direct fire of different positions. The Ukrainians cannot fire at Russian positions at the outskirts or by the industrial area from the central parts of the city. They have to go to the edge of the city. In the eastern and western parts, there is a wide area of the city rather than a shallow part like the south and the north. The city itself acts like a rectangle where the sides, which are wider, allow for stronger defenses, as the Russians, if they attack at any point from the east or from the west, they would be exposed to all of the Ukrainian positions all throughout the wider areas, whether it be from the south or from the north of the city. However, from the southern direction, they would only be exposed to a much shorter part, which is at the southern parts if they attack the south. Therefore, the south and the northern parts of the city are the weakest, yet also heavily fortified, because they are the weakest areas. And therefore we're seeing that heavy fighting is taking place in these areas, because in the end the Russians don't focus on capturing these parts as quick as possible, but rather as safe as possible, and that way is through the fortified areas, because if they go through the eastern and the western parts they could capture it much quicker, but it would be at a much higher cost due to armored assaults being fairly useless throughout these months of fighting we have seen in the Russo-Ukrainian war, which is now almost 2 years long. We then move on to the Marinka and Novomikhailivka directions, where first off in the direction of Marinka, the Russians throughout 2023 managed to capture the final parts of the city, and it is now fully under Russian control. Since then, we have seen them now move on to Hyhorivka, where the Ukrainians have fortified areas in between the two cities. In the fields, they have plenty of trenches and dug-ins, fortifications, bunkers, and so on, which they are using to prevent further Russian advances and the collapse of the Ukrainian lines in this direction. As such, we're seeing a continuous slow advance by the Russians. After getting a foothold in Hyhorivka, they have since then not advanced any further. As such, we're seeing that the Russians are still struggling to advance in the Ukrainian fortified areas. And again, this is based on the idea of safety over speed. As the saying goes, slow and steady wins the race. As for Novomikhailivka, we're seeing the Russians encroaching on the Ukrainian positions from the north, east, and south. This is all in an attempt to threaten the northern flank of Vuhledar. Vuhledar is very small itself, however, it is a very heavily fortified city here to the south of the Donetsk region. It protects and holds the flank of the whole area here to the south. This whole position here is all defended by Marinka in the north and Vuhledar in the south. The Russians have made multiple attempts at Vuhledar, which all failed, and this is likely due to the open supply lines the Ukrainians have to the area. So no matter how long they attempt to storm it, they will never run out of supplies in this section. They need to do a repeat of the attempts that they've made in the Avdiivka and Bakhmut direction, where they attack the flanks. And that is what Novomikhailivka is. It is attacking the flank of Vuhledar from the very far north, because there's essentially nothing here between Vuhledar and Konstantinivka, Novoukrayinka, so on. So the Russians are here attempting to gain control over the northern flank, which would then allow them to gain control over the fields here to the south of the Novomikhailivka direction, to the east of Vuhledar, which would strengthen their attempts at cutting off the roads here to the north of Vuhledar, allowing them to attack the flanks and storm Vuhledar from multiple directions, rather than just relying on the southern flank of Vuhledar, which has previously ended in failure. We then move on to the southern flank around Robotyne, where here the Russians, yet again after the end of the Ukrainian offensive, are now attempting to end the Ukrainian gains and recapture the positions that the Ukrainians gained throughout their offensive. We have seen that they, through the end of 2023, managed to recapture the trenches here to the west of Verbove in the final update of last year, and since then we're now seeing continuous fighting by Novoprokopivka in the northern direction, from Verbove in the western direction, and to the northwest of Robotyne towards the roads where the Russians have direct fire control of, as they are just a few fields away, allowing them to directly fire at any convoys or supplies going through the main road, which forces the Ukrainians to use the smaller and more difficult to use roads here to the northeast of Robotyne in the fields and roads going through that direction. So with this, we see that the Russians are trying to pressure the Ukrainian supply lines as they try to push on head-on against the Ukrainian positions to the southeast and east of Robotyne, trying to recapture the village, which would end all of the gains the Ukrainians gained through their summer offensive. We then move on to the final part of the front line where activities are happening, and that is the Ukrainians' attempts at getting a beachhead across the Dnieper River, where they're trying to hold on to the positions in Krynki, and the Russians are pressuring from both sides to the southwest and to the northeast, where they attempt to push out the Ukrainians in the area, and the Ukrainians just continue sending more and more troops towards Krynki in its biggest PR disaster since their long-awaited spring offensive. And that is all that is happening right now at the front line throughout from the north to the south. And that's going to be all for this video. The next one will cover what happened through 2023 as a recap. That is going to be all for this one. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.